Thank you for having me. In the following minutes, I would like to give you a broad introduction to open science by addressing the issue on how to make your data more open. I would like to do this from three perspectives: from the perspective of open science and open research data, from the perspective of the FAIR principles that provide technical guidance on how to realize openness for research data, and briefly from the perspective of the CARE principles that address a couple of ethical shortcomings of the former approaches. This lecture is also quite suitable as an introduction, since it shows how open science is a transversal issue that can help to improve research in general. First, a bit of introduction to open science, the definition, aims, and elements. And then about the connection of the FAIR principles and open science, how they interact, how the one is important for the other, and vice versa. And on the third part, I will briefly touch upon the ethical, legal, and social aspects by showing how CARE comes into the equation. Let's start. When we talk about open science, we really refer to two dimensions or perspectives, because on the one hand, open science can be understood as a global movement that reshapes the landscape of scientific research and makes research more transparent, fosters access, collaboration, accreditation, and public engagement. Open science is a concrete set of practices, methods, principles, tools, and platforms that are all aimed at making all aspects of scientific research openly accessible, transparent, reproducible, and reusable. There is no one definition of open science. However, this UNESCO recommendation of 2021 is a point of reference and also on a global level. Therefore, I put it up here because I think it gives quite a good idea what open science might be. The UNESCO defines open science as an inclusive construct that combines various movements and practices and aims to make multilingual scientific knowledge openly available, accessible, and reusable for everyone. And as you see, this citation refers to various movements and practices showing how open science is really broad and embraces and contains different trends of movements to open science, but also in society, and includes diverse aspects such as open access, public engagement, open educational resources, open data, of course, etc. The UNESCO recommendation then goes on and defines also the aims of open science. So it's about making scientific knowledge available, accessible, and reusable, about increasing collaboration and information sharing, and about opening processes of knowledge production for society. And it also makes quite clear that open science applies to all scientific fields and disciplines. It's not only about the natural sciences, but also about humanities, about open social science, etc. However, as I said, open science has no fixed definition. The UNESCO recommendation, as we saw, emphasizes the role for open science for society. And the DFG sees open science more in its functions related to science. More narrowly, it says that open science should be aligned with discipline-specific needs, and it must contribute to improve research processes and to accelerate access to information, therefore enabling advancement of knowledge and an increased reproducibility of methods and results. As we see here, open science for the DFG is about the scientific progress in the first place, and the effects for society aren't even here in the citation. They are in the positioning or in other places, but they're secondary thought. So for the DFG, open science is about science, whereas the UNESCO sees open science more broadly, also in its effects for society. Let's briefly come back to the UNESCO recommendation, because it also defines four central aspects of open science, which I think give a quite a good orientation what it may contain. The first one is open scientific knowledge, probably what we would think about first when we hear open science. So about open scientific publications, open research data, open educational resources, open software and source code, and open hardware. And then the second aspect are the open infrastructures that sustain this open scientific knowledge, the physical and the virtual infrastructures. The fourth aspect is the open engagement of societal actors, open engagement, public engagement, or citizen science also. We have a working package in WiNoDa. I won't go into detail on this either, or won't. Then let's come to the second part of this presentation and look at open science and the FAIR principles. They are the central concept if it's about making data findable, accessible, and reusable. And in effect, the FAIR principles also pursue several aims that are quite similar to those of open science. They are about improved findability and visibility of research data. They shall improve the efficiency of the research process by avoiding double work. They improve reproducibility and reuse. They shall facilitate collaboration and, in general, make the research process more transparent. And by this, of course, support good scientific practice, and also, on a more general level, the trust of society in science. And therefore, the FAIR principles will serve me as a guiding line to this second part of the of the presentation to address different aspects of open science throughout the research cycle. However, I won't go into detail as we have a separate section on research data management. It's about the idea of how it connects to open science in this part. The FAIR principles, they were proposed in 2016 by a group of scientists and organizations in the journal Scientific Data, and they focus primarily on technical aspects to ensure readability of research data by machines and humans. It's what enables automated discovery, access, and integration of data sets, and they are thought, or they shall be, a standard that is universally applicable, not only to research data, but also to all things connected to it, software, vocabularies, workflows for analysis, research data infrastructure, and the components are distinct, but they are complementary. They go together. One central aspect that appears all throughout FAIR is metadata, or data that provides information about other data on data. And I think also in the lecture on research data management, there will be more information on that. I won't go into detail here either, but that metadata appears in all 4 of the FAIR principles and is a central point to address. Then let's start with a closer look on the 4 FAIR principles related to open science. The data set is findable if it is described by comprehensive metadata, if it is assigned a persistent identifier, and if the place, so the repository where the data and the metadata are located, is searchable for humans and machines. Again, the machine readability is assured. And by this, findability supports the visibility of research, information sharing, and also might lead to collaboration. The first point of FAIR is persistent identifier, and they are a central aspect to ensure findability of persistent identifiers, or PID, are long-lasting references to digital objects and can be integrated into a URL, and they provide a persistent and unique reference to a digital resource. Persistent means here that in principle, the resource can be accessed permanently and it's not affected by domain changes. PIDs are meant to minimize the risk of dead links. Also, they are machine readable, which of course is important for FAIR. And they are also a key element for open science, and since they ensure findability and therefore also reproducibility and reusability. And moreover, they allow for correct attribution so that the person making an information available, a data set, a paper, gets the credit for it. There are a couple of well-known PIDs, including the DOI, for all types of academic output, and the ORCID, the Open Researcher and Contributor ID, which is used for researchers and which you can register yourself. There's also one for research institutions, the RAW, the Research Organization Registry, which is useful if you have to give your affiliation, and that's a way to do it uniquely and to do it persistently, that the correct name is used or unique name is used. And in the context of WiNoDa, it's interesting that there's also a couple of PIDs for physical objects. They aren't used as widely yet as the other ones. However, they are interesting because equally they can be used to unambiguously refer to and find a specific object in a collection, for example, and also to differentiate it from another object, which is maybe similar, but it's not this object. This unambiguous reference is also provided by PIDs. 2 examples for PID for physical objects. The first one is the IGSN, the International Generic Sample Number, which is used for material samples from the Earth and environmental science, so biology, geology, but also for samples for archaeology nowadays. And the idea is that the IGSN, this PID, resolves to a landing page. You see an example on the left that provides metadata and also provides information on where the sample is stored. And the IGSN is integrated into the DOI system. You get also a DOI when you register IGSN, but the IGSN provides more metadata fields, more possibilities to give also discipline-specific information on the sample. Then there's the second one, the Consortium of European Taxonomic Facilities Stable Identifier, which is used for specimens in natural and botanical collections. And this is a reference to a digital record for a specimen in a specific collection. If the specimen would change collection, then also the CSI, this identifier, would change, and that ideally should be reflected or put into the metadata. These PID address a couple of challenges that exist when dealing with physical objects. They might help to solve it. One point exactly is that physical objects are tied to a location and can also change locations, which is different from digital objects, which, at least in principle, are not tied to one single place and also can be, at least theoretically, accessed from everywhere. The PIDs help to describe where it is located exactly by putting it into the metadata. There can be samples taken from an object, and that's also something you could put into the metadata and tie together with a PID so that the reference is clear from the parent sample to the subsamples. PIDs might also help here. One challenge that you have, of course, is that since you have physical objects, you will have to find a way to put the digital PID physically on the other object. So you have to solve this, how to make sure that the PID stays together with the object in order to identify it, definitely. A second central infrastructure for findability are repositories, and those are platforms for archiving, documenting, and publishing all type of research output, and that of course includes data. In the context of open science, they enable access, or at least for all people that have an internet connection, reusability, and information sharing. There are different types of repositories, disciplinary ones, institutional ones, generic ones, and which one to choose depends on different criteria and what you want to do with the data. And there is this platform or this website, Free3Data, a registry of repositories where we can put in your search criteria and find a suitable repository for you. I'd like to stress that repositories are a central infrastructure to enable open science by publishing your data there, because that's an important step toward implementing open science principles, making data visible, reusable, reproducible for you and for others. However, repositories are not the only way to publish data, because it's also possible to publish data as a supplement to a research article. However, in that case, you mostly would have your data selected or aggregated, so you won't publish your primary data in a supplement normally. Another downside is that it's also not an independent publication. The data cannot be referenced directly. You have to go via the article, which is especially a problem for machine readability because you can't reference the data directly. Another possibility to publish data or publish about data is data papers and data journal. Those are descriptions with discussion or a reflection on the data set that is published in a public repository. You would publish the data in a repository and then write the data paper on it. And this gives you more space to contextualize your data, which then can, of course, facilitate reuse and reproducibility. There's also a process for quality check because data papers are peer reviewed. So you get feedback by your peers on if you included all the information necessary to understand the data, to reuse the data, and maybe ideas also on what to do with your data. And there's this quality aspect. Of course, data papers are also an independent publication that can be cited and listed, for example, in your publication list. There's quite an interesting possibility to make a data set that you put a lot of time into to give it more visibility. And if you're interested, there are some generic for all data journals for all disciplines. And then for the more, I'd say, WiNoDa specific disciplines, for example, there are a couple of data journals in archaeology, and GBIF has also a list for data journals in biodiversity. Two examples. The first one is from archaeology, open archaeology data, which is indeed a pure data journal because there are two types. There are journals who just publish data papers. They are mostly called pure data journals. And then there are other ones who accept different types of articles, so data papers, but also research articles. Here's an example for the second one, for ecological research. And I choose this one because I think it has this quite good or interesting proposal for the structure of a data paper. You can see what you have to put in there. Of course, there's the usual metadata, I say, so title, authors, abstract keywords. And then in the data description, it's quite detailed how the data paper should be structured, what information should be included, the identifier of the data set, who contributed, because it's, of course, not only the data set creator, there might be a data set owner who is different from the first person, then information on the project, where it was created, different information on coverage, geographical, temporal, taxonomic, since it's an ecological journal. Of course, the methods that were used to collect the data, to create the data, quite some information on the data structure so that you're able to understand it and use it, information on accessibility and publications that are linked to the data or that were for which the data was used. I think this gives quite a clear idea on how such a data paper could look like, and also an idea why it could be interesting for people to read it and then to be able to work with the data it describes. One thing, if we talk about making data findable, one aspect from the perspective of open science is open access. That's closely connected to data publication, and it's important that access to the data is open to everyone and that it can also be reused freely. And open access is one of the key elements of open science, and also one of the first aspects that was discussed in this context in the declarations of Berlin and Budapest from the early 2000s, for example. And from the Declaration of Budapest, this extract is from, and you see the two key points are the free availability on the internet on the one hand, and then the free reuse. You see this long list of things you should be able to do with the data set. These are key to open access. There are different ways to do open access, such as green or gold open access. However, that mostly refers to text publications. What is important for all types of open access, independent for text publication or dataset, is that they require an open license, because in that way the free reuse and the legally secure reuse is guaranteed. Open licenses is key. Accessibility is the second FAIR principle, and a dataset is accessible if it can be accessed and retrieved by an open, free, and universally implementable protocol, if the repository allows for authorization and the metadata is available, even if access to the data itself is restricted due to ethical legal aspects. One important condition to accessibility are open infrastructures, and here's also the direct connection to open science. Open infrastructures might be infrastructures that we already talked about, such as repositories or PID platforms, but also platforms for collaboration, open source software, and open standards and protocols. And of course, open infrastructures shall be publicly financed, and they shall ensure long-term sustainability of the research infrastructures, that they can be shared and used by different actors and communities, so that they are open for all that need them and that want to use them. The third FAIR principle is interoperability. That means that the data can be exchanged, interpreted, and combined with other data sets. It uses formal vocabularies, ontologies, and metadata schemata, and that they themselves are fair. And the research data is linked to other data via persistent identifier. This last point is closely connected to the concept of linked open data, a central concept of open science. What is linked open data? Maybe first, what is linked data? Wikipedia defines it as structured data, which is interlinked with other data, so it becomes more useful through semantic queries. And well, linked open data is then data that is additionally open. So it is at least published on the internet with an open license. That would be the minimum. And one point of reference to judge the openness of data or of linked data is the 5-star deployment scheme for open data by Tim Berners-Lee. And I think that one describes hands-on and straightforward what open data shall be about. The idea behind it is quite simple. You get a star for each step you complete, and further steps include previous ones. And the first star would be that you have your data in any format published on the internet with an open license. The second star would be that the data is also machine readable, so it is structured data, for example, an Excel sheet. And a third star would be that it is in a non-proprietary format, such as a CSV instead of Excel. And I think at least to the third star, you get quite easy. The next two steps are a bit more difficult and require technical knowledge. For the fourth star, you would have to apply open standards from the W3C to identify the data points so that other people can link to your data. And the fifth star would be that you link your data to other people's data to provide more context. And only this last step would then be linked open data. Here's one example for linked open data for a project for the Museum für Naturkunde Berlin. What the authors did was they used Wikidata to create entries for collection agents who play a central role in building up natural history collections. And they linked those collection agents then via PIDs to the collections they contributed to, but also to their publication and the institutions they worked at. And by creating this linked open data, you can see the connections between the collection agents and the documents or the objects they created or that they brought into the collections. But by following the links, you also see connections that aren't visible directly in the data, but that only become apparent if you have this machine readable linked open data from one node to the other, and get also more information. For example, where the objects ended up that the collection agents collected at several points. They might be separated nowadays, but they are, of course, connected to one collection agent, or also what other persons were involved in collecting the objects that are not visible in the data itself, indigenous people who were involved in collecting the objects. You get quite new additional information on how the whole connection networks work. That's, I think, quite an interesting example for linked open data in the context of WiNoDa. The fourth fair principle is reusability, and that I should say would also include reproducibility. Reusable means that the data enables new research, whereas reproducibility is much more about refining published results. And both aspects are, of course, important aims for fair data, but also for open science. As I say, if a dataset is reusable, if it is described by rich metadata, if it can be cited via persistent identifier, and if it's using a license that is human and machine readable, all three aspects we already mentioned. And reuse and reproducibility, of course, central aims for both open science and fair, and they are important because they improve efficiency, so they avoid duplication of research tasks. They can help to preserve primary research materials by minimizing invasiveness. Think about, for example, you have an object where you've taken a sample from to make an analysis, and if you publish the data, then the next person who wants to do the same or similar analysis maybe does not have to take the sample again, by this preserving the object. Then it allows research materials that are no longer available. For example, an excavation that only can be done once, of course, has to be documented in order that also other people can work on it, because you can't repeat it. Then towards the researcher, it improves visibility, might lead to more citations, and by this improving the reputation, it might open opportunities for collaboration, and in general, of course, reuse and reproducibility improve transparency of research for other researchers, but also to society in general. And again, here we have the improving trust in society, in science, as a general aim. A central aspect to ensuring or guaranteeing reusability are, of course, licenses. I already mentioned that, because they provide a simple and standardized way to grant usage rights to research data. And they are basically a type of contract between the person that makes the data available and the person that is using the data. And the most common open licenses for research data and publication are the Creative Commons, that are also recognized internationally. There are different types of Creative Commons licenses. The most compatible for open science, however, are CC0, which means that the data can be used without further conditions, and CC BY, which requires that the author is cited when using the data. And if you're including software with your data, then remember that there might be different requirements and licenses. One key element for making reusability, reproducibility possible is, of course, documentation, because without a detailed documentation of how or in what context you collected data, how you cleaned and analyzed it, and what is contained in your data and how it is organized, use and reproduction are nearly impossible. And documentation will not only help other researchers reusing your data, but also yourself. If you want to come back to a data set after some time, let's say after 3 years, would you be able to understand your data set? Probably only if it's well documented. And also it might help if you want to publish it. If you have a good documentation, that becomes way easier. With regard to open science, I like to stress again that good documentation is key, not only for open science, but also for the principles and as a basis for good scientific practice. All those concepts, of course, go beyond documentation, but neither of them, I'd say, would be possible without it. What I would like to say a few words on in the context of open science is open methodologies, because of course, documentation is key, doing documentation, but in the context of open science, it also means not only documenting for yourself, but also making your documentation available. That would be open methodologies, your documentation, your methods, your tools and software, and do that ideally in a way that allows for reuse by using open software or open formats and standards. An open methodology is not only about making your research reusable, of course, but also about making it transparent and comply with the principles of good scientific practice. And one possibility to do this would be pre-registration, or one aspect of open methodologies. That means you publicly register a research project on an online platform or with a journal before you start with the data collection. And in that way, you make transparent your hypothesis and your methods, and other researchers will be able to compare your findings with your approach. Pre-registration as part of methodologies would be a way to ensure scientific quality. Now, fair and open science is, of course, not only about making your data available, but it's also about using data that other researchers have made accessible. And where can you find data sets? On the one hand, of course, where you can also publish it, so on repositories and data journals. But if you want to have a broader search, maybe you don't have a specific repository where your discipline publishes, then there are also meta search engines that search in several repositories or also other data sources. Let's briefly see how a dataset research works in practice. We start with the Open Explorer, which is an aggregator of research output that is financed by the EU and that contains more than 86 million datasets. And now we are looking for datasets that are related to the archaeological site of Göbekli Tepe, which is an important Neolithic settlement. And as you see here, we get 5 research results. That's already limited to research data here because OpenIRE has all types of research output, but we are interested in the research data here. We have these results, and if we are clicking on one of them, you get the individual view with more information and abstract, the authors, and also the DOIs to the original dataset because OpenIRE is only an aggregator for metadata. And by clicking on the link, you get to the dataset itself, which in this case is on Zenodo. So you have an interesting dataset. What would you have to do? The first thing would be to check the provenance. Where was the data collected? Where is it coming from? Who published it and where? And the question here, is it trustworthy? Then if that's clear, you would have to check the legal conditions. Are you allowed to use it? Ideally, it has a license. If not, maybe the platform has terms of use, and if not, you really would have to contact the data provider. And the third step would be to check the quality for the data. FAIR is, of course, very important because it enables the reuse, but does not necessarily mean that's useful for you, because FAIR does not necessarily mean that's also fit for your purpose. In a nutshell, what you can do to check for reusability is check for open science compliance. So check provenance, check legal conditions are closely related to the things I just talked about. Open access, open licenses allow for secure reuse. Open methodologies, software formats allow for technical reuse. And open methodologies also allow you to check if the data is trustworthy. Open science is not an aim in itself, but can play a decisive role in advancing scientific research by making it more reusable. If you use a data set, then don't forget to cite it, because in that way the data provider receives credit, and because also that's the basis of good scientific practice. Let's come back to this data set on Göbekli Tepe and see how we could assess it. If you have a look at the documentation, you see that the basic documentation is available, for example, about the data creation, the authors, and there's also information on required software, but other information is missing. For example, the full citation of the article that is cited, not as is referenced in the text, and also information on the research project is quite scarce. The software that is required to work with the ontology, because this dataset is an ontology, is freely available. However, only one of the 2 tools is also open source, and the other one only would be available upon request, which is of course not ideally, because if the source code isn't open, it can no longer be accessible. However, from the perspective of open science and also of reuse, I think the biggest issue here is a license, because it's published under the CC BY and C and D license. And C means a non-commercial, and D means non-derivative, which means it does not allow for any changes. You're only allowed to use this ontology such as it is. You aren't allowed to adapt it to your research question, to expand it. And that's really something that limits reuse considerably. And with a more open license, or CC BY or CC BY SA, that is more also in line with open access recommendations, the ontology would be far more fit for your reuse. Up to now, I talked about open science and open data using the FAIR principles as a guiding line. I would like to stress that the concepts, of course, have a significant overlap, and that was the basis for these presentations, but they are not synonymous. FAIR does not necessarily mean ex maximo open, but rather calls for the principle as open as possible, as close as necessary, and there might be good reasons to restrict access to data. And open data, on the other hand, does not comply necessarily with technical requirements for FAIR, so open data might just mean a data set with an open license on the internet. It does not have to be interoperable, it does not have to provide metadata. It should, but it does not have to be in order to be open data. Of course, there are legal ones: privacy law, data protection, intellectual property law. Then for the disciplines in WiNoDa, there's this issue of protection of location for archaeological sites and indeed endangered species, that you don't want to reveal the exact location in order to protect these sites, to avoid criminal actions. That's an example for dual use, avoid harm by research, by publishing research results. And then there's this issue of data provenance, of course, data that was acquired under doubtful or clearly illegal circumstances in colonial context or under National Socialism. You would have to think if you can use the data at all, and if you use it, what you have to do to document it well. And then there's this issue of restricting data involving indigenous and social vulnerable groups. The CARE principles were developed in 2019 by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance in coordination with other groups, indigenous experts, and they address this tension between protecting indigenous rights and interests on the one hand and supporting open data, including data sharing, big data, and machine learning on the other hand. And the CARE principles shall complement FAIR. They are not meant to replace FAIR. The slogan here is be fair and care. And the CARE principles shall take into account issues that FAIR does not address, ethical issues, but also historical and power imbalances and dynamics. And in general, they present themselves as a people-centric approach to the more data-centric, the more technical FAIR approach. The CARE principles aren't concrete instructions, but rather principles to consider when dealing with data that has a connection to indigenous or otherwise marginalized groups. And the aim is here not to reproduce power imbalances and to guarantee the rights of these people are respected. They were formulated for indigenous groups, but I think they could also apply to other socially marginalized groups in order to protect their rights. And indigenous data is a broad concept here. It's, of course, the data collected on the cultural heritage of indigenous people or groups. Anthropological data, maybe the first thing we would think about, but it's also about data that has any connection to indigenous territory, also data on natural resources from these territories, which is far broader. And it's not only about data that is collected nowadays, but it's also about data of indigenous provenance that's already found in archives or collection. And what CARE would call for is that if you work with any kind of this data, you should get in contact with the representatives of these groups and do this from the moment the project planning starts. Make it part of your project to work with the people who has the rights on this data. Of course, the CARE principles are not legally binding, but for biological and genetic materials, there are international legally binding regulations on access and benefit sharing, and that would be the Nagoya Protocol. So if you are interested in that, or if you're working with this type of data, you could check out the information on the Nagoya Protocol Hub. As I said, the principles address the issues that indigenous people shall benefit from the data and have the necessary skills to use them themselves. It's also about data literacy, creating data literacy. That would be the collective benefit. Then that the indigenous people have the right to decide on their data, authority to control, the second principle, and that the researchers and data creator take responsibility, the third principle, on the consequences also of using indigenous data, not only about the rights to the data, but also on what happens with the data next after the project finishes. And the fourth principle, the ethics, allude to the overall aim of CARE to assess for all instances of data collection and usage the benefits and harms for indigenous people in the present time and the future. That is, I'd say, the bottom line of CARE. Wrap up, what would be the takeaways from the presentation of open science and FAIR and CARE? In a nutshell, the three principles approach research data, open research data from three distinct but complementary perspectives. Open science is about opening process of knowledge production. The FAIR principles are rather a universal technical standard to improve findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And the CARE principles address the tension between opening data and protecting rights and interests of indigenous people, and you could say marginalized groups in general, though they are a call if there is a tension to reflect on these issues. Of course, the three aspects are important all in their own rights. There is no hierarchical order. They are complementary, but as you see, they are not in all cases compatible, and the three perspectives can help you to weigh the possible benefits and harms for those involved during the research cycle. And if there is a tension, that's really called to reflect on your data and also to discuss the intended uses and discuss the issues in exchange with others. There are three perspectives on data, on research data, that can help you to not only improve your research, but also to make it include ethical and to extend legal issues when working with your data. And with this, I would like to thank you for your attention.